One of my ex-colleagues at Metal Bulletin used to say that once a steely, always a steely, and I think he's absolutely right. The steel industry and the way it's constantly adapting and innovating is quite remarkable. I'm privileged. I'm Diana Kinch, British journalist who has lived and worked in the UK, France, Spain and Mexico, and for more than 25 years in Brazil. For most of my career, I've written about the economy, trade, commodities, and in particular steel and metals. Going on for 40 years now, writing about steel and metals, and not tired of it yet. So many types of steel, minerals and metals to write about, so much change, and the opportunity to travel because it's such a global industry, and I've always had the travel bug. So, how did I get into steel and metals? Totally by chance, considering I'd studied modern languages and literature at university. I left a job writing press releases at the Central Office of Information, a government job in London. Apparently a good job, but lacking in stimulus, terribly lacking in stimulus. I had to write exactly 250 words in each release on British products like women's underwear being shown at trade fairs overseas. Really not my type of thing at all. One day during my lunch break, I walked past the Metal Bulletin office in London near Waterloo Station and saw a job advertised in the window. Ferrous reporter, must be prepared to travel. I went into the office to ask about the job. Of course, these were the days before the internet, 1984. The receptionist inquired, ferrous or non-ferrous? And I had no idea what she was talking about. But I got the job anyway. For the first few months I wrote gibberish about blast furnaces and converters and the like, as the editor told me. But I soon got hooked on the global nature and the foreign trade aspects of the business. One of my ex-colleagues at Metal Bulletin used to say that once a steely, always a steely, and I think he's absolutely right. The steel industry and the way it's constantly adapting and innovating is quite remarkable. I'm privileged to have witnessed a whole generation of changes that have been significant for all involved, for the rest of society and the world. I managed to write about steel, metals and mining not only for Metal Bulletin, but also for Reuters, Bloomberg, Dow Jones, the Wall Street Journal, and currently S&P Global Commodity Insights, the commodities news arm of the Standard & Poor's rating agency. My personal life, and inevitably the steel industry too, has changed dramatically since I started to write about steel and metals in 1984 at Metal Bulletin in London. Steel and my personal life became all intertwined. And that is largely because I moved to Brazil at 1987 at the age of 32 to write about steel, metals and mining based here in Rio. This was all part of a bigger plan. I'd been trying to figure out how to get to Brazil for some time, since living in Mexico a few years earlier, where I'd married my now ex-husband, Englishman Phil. I loved the Latin, and particularly the Latin American culture. I'd been hooked on that since school and university, possibly guided by my parents' influence. My dad was a professor of modern languages at Liverpool University, and my mum a French teacher, both also with the writing and the travel bugs. And I really wanted to have a Latin type extended family. That was my dream. Phil and I had tried for a baby without success, later lost one, and we'd also tried to adopt a baby in Mexico. Everyone there had told us, oh, it's so hard for foreigners to adopt in Mexico. Too many restrictions. Brazil, you have to go to Brazil. So my mind was already made up. I just had to find a sustainable way to get to Brazil. And steel helped me. Remember, I'd applied for the job where it said the candidate must be prepared to travel. So after 2.5 years of working in London for Metal Bulletin, I put in a proposal that the company should open an office in Brazil to cover Latin America, preferably Rio, as that was where Vale and CSN at the time were based. Because of my languages, I was covering Latin America from London, and that was hard because of the time difference, as I pointed out to them. Brazil being 4 hours and Mexico 7 hours behind London for most of the year. Brazil was at the time such a big steel exporter, and the continent had so much mineral potential. It was a shot in the dark, but amazingly, Metal Bulletin immediately agreed and said they would send me out to Brazil with my salary. It all fitted in very nicely, in fact, almost as if it was preordained by destiny. So I came here to Brazil because I wanted to adopt a baby, but I was also really interested already in steel. And I had a secret dream while in London that one day I would visit CSN's Volta Redonda steelworks. That was sure to be exciting, I thought. So in September 1987, having never visited Brazil before, and actually not even speaking Portuguese, just Spanish, English and French, I flew out to Rio to set up an office for Metal Bulletin, managing it for 20 years, opening up plenty of new markets for them as interest grew rapidly in steel and metals in the region and mining. It was, of course, a huge adventure, especially as I came on my own. As Phil had got a good job in London, he was loath to leave. And in any case, he had fallen in love with a woman who he'd met in his Brazilian Portuguese class. Ironically, the class he was taking to prepare eventually to come out to Brazil to live, which never actually happened. After I'd been in Rio 2 years, in 1989, I had the opportunity to adopt my first son, Raul Felipe, who's now 33. Then I was offered his half-brother, Daniel, who's 32. I was enjoying myself so much that I applied to adopt a baby girl, and Beatrice is now 25. Just before being called to adopt Beatrice in Rio, however, the minors' court in Rio, the Juizado de Menores, had told me it would take me ages for me to be able to adopt a newborn baby girl, because that was what Brazilian couples, particularly the women, looked for most, and I already had 2 sons. So the court suggested I go to the south of Brazil to register myself for adoption in various municipalities there, which I did. In those days, the adoption service worked at a municipal and not a national level in Brazil. Eventually, over the years, my name came to the top of the waiting lists in all the municipalities which I'd applied to. So I adopted half-brothers Joseph and Simon, now 28 and 25, in Prudentópolis, Paraná, Alice, now 18, in Irachi, Paraná, and then later Gabriel and Raquel, also half-sisters, now 14 and 13, in San Francisco de Itabapoana, Rio de Janeiro state. So I adopted 8 children in total, have never regretted it, have had a great time. I was actually offered more, but I thought that 8 was probably enough. I didn't want to make an institution, I wanted to make a Latin American family. So I did get my extended Latin family and stayed in Brazil initially for 25 years, interspersing nappy changes and school runs with news about blast furnaces, blast furnace relines, export trade, plant visits and the like, working out of my home office, initially in Leblon, and then Copacabana, and then later Santa Teresa, where I bought a house. After the 25 years, I did take my family back to London for educational reasons and attempted to rediscover at least part of my European cultural identity. After 10 years in the UK, however, I'm now back again in Santa Teresa with my 14-year-old daughter, Gabriela, who was anxious to understand better her Brazilian roots and who has always seemed far more Brazilian than British, in fact. So these are my indelible links with Brazil. So what was it like adapting to Brazil? I have to say, in the beginning, it was really, really hard on a personal level, especially as I was living and working on my own for the first time ever. It was like going through an initiation ceremony for something I didn't know the rules for. I became anxious and lost a lot of weight. At first, everyone thought I was Argentinian because of my Portunol and fair looks, So I hastily did a Portuguese course, but inevitably I couldn't disguise the fact that I am a gringa. And of course I was still doing adventurous gringa things like getting the bus on my own late at night. And I paid the price, suffering no fewer than 10 assaults in my first 2 years. Even had my clothes and money robbed when I went to the beach in Baja, and had to borrow money to get the bus home in my bikini. Not a very English type of thing to do, in fact. These assaults stopped, I might add, when I became a mum. There was only one more assault several years later when my car was taken at gunpoint when I was in it with my kids, picking them up from school, in fact. That one even made the press, as I was president of the Foreign Correspondents Association in Brazil at the time. Foreign Press Group President held up at gunpoint in Santa Teresa, Ricardo Boechat wrote in O Globo. On a professional level, however, I found things easy because everyone in the industry was so welcoming to me. This was a pleasant change after Europe, where business tends to be more formal and people don't like to give much information away, or they have to be approved. Here the Brazilian and other Latin American business people's willingness to give me plenty of details for stories was just great, even though possibly I think some of them sometimes regretted it later. But I was really able to write lots of articles, and Metal Bulletin was pleased. Even managed to set up a group of stringers working out of other Latin American countries. But the bureaucracy took a toll in terms of time and quite often financial resources. Thousands of dollars to buy a fixed telephone line in those days. And the hyperinflation and frequent changes of finance ministers and currencies was tough. I arrived during José Sarney's presidency and even accompanied him on a press trip on the inauguration of a new spur of the Carajás Railway. I observed, as if it was some kind of soap opera, novella, Fernando Collor de Mello's presidential stint. I appreciate I was really fortunate to be earning dollars in those days. But one thing was for sure, Brazil was an excellent place for journalists because everything was so unpredictable and there were constant changes, so much news. As I mentioned, I got involved with the Foreign Correspondents Association in Brazil, ACR, which also really helped me make friends, contacts and understand the way things work, o jeito brasileiro. I had the honour later to serve 4 years as the association's president and 10 or more years as vice president and director. I have always considered that in Brazil things are either fantastic or terrible, never middle of the road. The place still continues extremely unpredictable. I personally find that stimulating, though of course the wait to get things done continues incredibly frustrating. To the plant visits and interviews. My first interview, still memorable, was with Marco Polo de Melo Lopes as president of the ASP, Brazil's private steelmakers association. Of course, he's still doing basically the same job of leading and representing the industry now, even though the industry changed with privatization and the association morphed to IBS, then later Instituto Aço Brasil. My first plant visit, just a few weeks after I arrived in Brazil, was to Cozipa in São Paulo, invited by the Steelworks press officer Edi Camargo. This was my first time also on the Ponte Aérea, Rio, São Paulo, and I had no idea what to wear or how Brazilian Steelworks visits would compare to the rather formal and very safe European plant visits I'd been on previously. So I wore a bright lime green jumpsuit, macacão. Of course, I was a much younger woman then, totally into risk-taking, and felt very happy that it seemed to go down very well. What was at the time free-flowing whiskey on the Ponte Aérea in the evenings also went down very well with the new correspondent in Brazil. I believe now it's morphed into a small juice and a biscuit. They're obviously much better for our health. Shortly afterwards, I got the visit to CSN in Volta Redonda, and I do admit I felt slightly unsafe as they showed me everything, even some parts with very oily floors. But how exciting was that? Seeing that steel whizzing down the casters and rolling mills. I think they were working well above their installed capacity at that time. The old-style CSN guest house and restaurant was also very impressive. But what really made the visit for me was that outside the guest house, I was admiring the jabuticaba trees. And one of the engineers who was showing me around climbed up the tree to get down some fruit for me. You wouldn't get that in Europe, I thought. Great stuff. But where I really fell in love with Brazil was on a trip to visit aluminium maker Albaraz in Paraste, and was taken on a tour in a motorboat around Barcarena. So exciting and so different culturally from anything I'd experienced elsewhere, just so different from anything I'd seen in Europe. It was then that I knew I was seriously committed to Brazil. I arrived in Brazil only 2 years after it emerged from military rule. With the transition to democracy, things started to change in business. It was clear that industries run by the old state apparatus needed an injection of capital from the private sector, both Brazilian and international, to modernize and stand on their own 2 feet. Brazilian steel saw massive consolidation and merger and acquisition activity in the late 1980s and the 1990s as the stronger and better run private companies, including Grupo Gerdau, gained ground. The 5 big Siderbrais works, and some smaller ones too, were privatized to reduce state debt. Politically painful, of course, as jobs were lost, but necessary for the move forward to sustainability, both economic, financial, and environmental. At one time, the big story in Brazilian steel was about CSN, and that it was losing $1 million a day. And that was indeed why it needed to be privatized. And international journalists were needed to try to explain what on earth was going on, who was buying what, in which company, and for how much, and what all this meant, particularly with the so-called privatization of CVRD in 1997, where there was a complicated crisscross arrangement between CVRD and CSN. Luckily, CVRD also changed its name in 2007 to something far more palatable internationally, Vale. In the 1980s and 1990s, people weren't so concerned, generally speaking, about the concept of sustainability. And there was a lot of waste, both of time and resources, that started to be severely criticized by business organizations, including Instituto Aço Brasil, in those days still IBS, and Firjão, the Rio de Janeiro State Industry Federation, and of course institutions in São Paulo, Belo Horizonte and Brasilia, and elsewhere. One of the big topics was Custo Brasil, the Brazil cost of high cascading or duplicated taxes, port inefficiencies, overpayments and other untransparencies, which Marco Polo and industry leader Jorge Gerdau Johan Petter had become expert at calculating. A fascinating topic for steel articles in the international press also, especially as Brazil was at the time a great exporter of competitively priced steel, attracting international dumping cases, including from the European Union. And of course, there had been other restrictions, such as the voluntary restraint agreement with quotas in the US. Brazil even exported to China, whose steel production was relatively low until the late 1980s. Had Brazil not had its Brazil cost to contend with, it might have been even more feared or even more revered in international markets. The Metal Bulletin readers were getting very familiar with the term. Diana, I challenge you to go a whole week without using the term Brazil cost in your articles, one editor said to me at one point in the late 80s or early 90s. I did try, but the concept did linger. Nowadays, it's far less common to hear people talk about the Brazil cost. Inevitably, Brazil has undergone some social and fiscal reform, and you no longer have to pay thousands of dollars for a fixed line telephone on the black market. But I do believe the Brazil cost still exists, with excessive bureaucracy being an inherent inefficiency dragging down the system. The Brazilian concept of time to this day can also seem different from the concept used in the US and Northern Europe and Scandinavia. Sometimes I do feel that inhabitants of some of the more stress-prone nations in this world could do with taking a new look at the whole concept and meaning of time, and could even learn a lot from Brazilians. But in business, we still can't get away from the old adage, time is money. But times, they were a-changing, and they started to change very fast in the 1990s and early 2000s, with the exponential rise of the Chinese economy and its steel and metals industries. Within a few years, China had eclipsed Brazil as one of the world's major steel exporters. Indeed, it wasn't long before the trade relation was turned upside down, with competitive Chinese steel exports to Brazil starting to cause difficulties for Brazilian mills and pricing. Suddenly there was too much steel capacity in the world, and that still continues, perhaps accounting for a later period of stagnation in the investments that had been planned. Would Brazil have done anything different? That was a question I put to Roberto Giannetti da Fonseca, who was in the 1980s an exporter of steel to China with Cochia Trading, and now an economist and part of the Lidi grouping of business people. Giannetti said at the end of June at a meeting of Lidi in Rio that Brazil didn't manage to overcome the problems it faced in the 1980s, losing out to China and to South Korea due to lack of policies to address certain issues, to address long periods of high interest rates due to high public expenditure, long periods of having an overvalued currency. This was coupled with low levels of investment in processing raw materials to produce value-added products and low investments in consumer markets. Brazil was known very much, the Brazilian steel industry was known very much there as a big steel slabs exporter rather than a higher value-added steel exporter. And some of the same problems persist today, although there are high hopes that the tax reform, Reforma Tributária, may be completed in coming months and get rid of cumulative taxes, which could, of course, improve competitiveness and may get rid of the expression Brazil cost once and for all. Talking about the concept of time, though, it does seem crazy that Brazil's tax reform was already being discussed for about 10 years before I left Brazil in late 2012. I spent 10 years in London and returned to Brazil earlier this year, and still hear a lot of discussion about the tax reform, the emerging tax reform. I could hardly believe that they are still discussing the same tax reform after so many years. So I checked with my business contacts, and yes, it really is the very same tax reform, but just with a few tweaks. The rise of China also revolutionized the iron ore market, but this has actually benefited Brazil, as there is certainly not an overcapacity problem with high-grade iron ore, such as Brazil produces. Steel demand from China's and Asia's rapid urbanization starting in the 1990s and their rapidly rising steel production levels, these were growing far more quickly than new iron ore supplies could be brought on stream. After all, new mines do need a lot of permitting and community approvals, and quite rightly so, and perhaps increasingly so in the present day. The 40-year-old benchmark iron ore annual pricing system collapsed in 2010, because it didn't make sense for the Japanese or German steel mills to settle an iron ore price with an Australian or Brazilian miner if the Chinese didn't also agree. After all, the Chinese from the early 2000s, they were building up their position to eventually buy 70% of seaborne traded iron ore, as they do today. With the new spot market, iron ore market prices doubled virtually overnight, and futures and options trade started to flourish on the world's big commodities exchanges. Companies such as S&P Global, for which I now work, became experts in spot market price assessments. Trades no longer needed to be physically delivered, and the market started to financialize, as they say, with investors and speculators joining the fray. Retail trades on China's Dalian exchange reached billions of tons, several multiples of the current 1.9 billion metric tons a year of physical iron ore trading. Very impressive. Another big change since I arrived in Brazil was the widespread uptake of computers and the internet. When I left Metal Bulletin in London in 1987, we still used noisy typewriters and liquid paper to hide our mistakes. A messenger used to take the sheets typed with articles from the office to a typesetters outside London, where I used to go to check page proofs, and then the publication was printed with full-colour ads on glossy paper twice a week. It was very satisfying to hold and read those news magazines, many years editions of which I still have in my house in Santa Teresa. They seem like history books now, and I love browsing through the ones that have been spared by the termites, the cupins. People in the industry used to refer to the Metal Bulletin magazine as the Bible of the metals trade. I guess something to be cherished. However, I don't hear anyone nowadays referring to an online news website, whatever it may be, or even a PDF as a Bible. And it might even seem sacrilegious to do so. The speed at which we consume and cherish information has changed radically. Data, or intelligence as we tend to call it, has in itself turned into one of the world's biggest commodities, something to be paid for, processed and consumed as fast as possible in case it goes off. When I first arrived in Rio, I used to send my articles into London via telex, by the telex operator in the Leblon post office, Baiano Eovaldo. We spent so much time together, me helping Eovaldo with the words in English, him helping me with the transmission, that we ended up forming a great team, and he became my first Brazilian husband in a partnership that lasted a couple of years, but a friendship that will last forever. I soon got a large computer of my own, costing I think $4,200 or $4,500, and had to get used to the CompuServe transmission system, which used a rather user-unfriendly system where usernames were all numbers. After that, technology advanced by leaps and bounds, and I got my first mobile phone, an big analog brick that got cloned at the age of 40. Don't show it in the street. I remember Glaucia Figueiredo, the much-loved press officer at IBS, advised me. Arrival of the internet totally changed the way journalists worked, raised the bar competitively and in terms of the speed of getting news out, as well as features or value-added copy. And it was no longer enough to write up a press release that may be found by anyone interested on a website. Journalists have to be reporters, analysts, layout artists, and all those jobs that used to exist separately, now all at once. Increasingly, their work is measured on how agile they are at keeping abreast of real-time information on social media and on posting their own news or reports there, preferably with eye-catching photos and an intelligent-sounding spin. While we still work as a team in theory, there's much more of an individual touch as to how we present ourselves on social media nowadays. Talking of publications, there are two very special books that I was presented with very early on in my stay in Brazil that have been quite invaluable to use and a great pleasure to a linguist such as I consider myself. The Dicionário Metalúrgico Inglês-Português e Português-Inglês. The dictionary is published by the Brazilian Metallurgical Materials and Mining Association, ABM, in 1987, compiled by James L. Taylor and with a foreword by Antonio Emílio de Moraes. The other one is Elafas, now Alaceiros, trilingual, no less, English, Portuguese, Spanish, Iron and Steel Dictionary, published in Santiago de Chile in 1994. I would say masterpieces in their field. In recent years, steel and metals trades and markets have changed yet again. Protectionism has grown and markets are increasingly shaped by geopolitics and the energy transition. Regionalisation has been imposed in certain areas by supply chain disruption due to COVID-19, the war in Ukraine, and by legislation such as CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, and also the Critical Raw Materials Act in the European Union, and IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act in the US. These all encourage local sourcing, where possible, in mining and processing. Of course, it's the need to decarbonise that underpins these new regulations. But regionalisation is such a misnomer, I feel, in these times when political rather than regional alliances are being set up. Alejandro Wagner, Executive Director of ALACEDO, the Latin American Steel Association, told me in May that up to 90% of Latin America's steel trade is intra-regional, which is impressive. Ironically, politically based regional groups in Latin America, such as Mercosur or the Andean Pact, still, however, seem to be largely in their infancy in terms of broader cooperation or organisation. However, this is not the case elsewhere. In critical minerals, it seems that politically based alliances are being set up regardless of region or the distance between members. As the EU Commission said when it launched its critical materials policy in March, clubs of like-minded members are being set up. So we will see lithium mined in Australia being sent to Saudi Arabia for processing in facilities built with UK money, with the end products being consumed in the European Union, because this type of supply chain has, we are told, a low carbon footprint, because its production and transport logistics are based on renewable energy. This is selective rather than true regionalisation, because it's still wasting a lot of resources in shipping products around the world. But prices of decarbonised or low carbon steel and metal products aren't going to be cheap, for sure. We're going to be paying for that transport. In some nations, it doesn't seem to matter now where products are produced, so long as China isn't involved in the supply chain, even though China today still dominates around 90% of the world's lithium and rare earths processing, and of course produces some 57% of the world's steel and consumes 70% of its seaborne iron ore. Some governments and traders are saying it's become politically risky to depend on Chinese supplies for electric vehicle batteries or other parts, wind tower turbines, other industries, in case China invades Taiwan and sanctions need to be imposed. And this would mean new supply chains would urgently need to be set up. The new slogan in EU supply chains, sorely disrupted by sanctions on Russia is ABC, standing quite bluntly for anywhere but China. Brazil, which likes to be seen as politically neutral, could of course do very well out of this because of its endowment of mineral reserves, including critical minerals, and its clean energy matrix. Brazil is being sought after to set up partnerships in critical minerals with the US and with the EU, various countries in the EU. Brazil is about to develop its Lithium Valley in Minas Gerais, and will certainly expand its green pig, iron and low carbon steel output, which are already creating interest abroad. Recent foreign investments in steel have included Valorec's transfer of a tube making plant from Germany to Brazil to reduce the company's costs and carbon footprint, and ArcelorMittal's continued regional expansion with acquisition of Companhia Siderúrgica do Pecém in Brazil's Ceará state, where planned downstream expansions will be in the low carbon area. Domestic investments included Aço Cearense, which is planning a low carbon steelmaking initiative with Vale based on green pig iron produced by Vale's subsidiary TecnoRed, and there are likely to be many more, especially when the new green hydrogen hubs planned for the ports of Pecém, Açu in Rio de Janeiro state and Rio Grande do Sul start becoming a reality from around 2025, which will promote the use of green hydrogen-based direct reduced iron steelmaking. It's notable that Fortescue Metals Group from Australia has a major green hydrogen hub planned for the port of Pecém. The energy matrix is clearly key. Government statistics say 84% of Brazil's electrical generation is based on renewables, more than twice the world average. And this should be a trump card for Brazil moving forward in terms of attracting investments from companies wanting to keep down their carbon footprints. But are institutions strong and stable enough to help attract investments? According to some investors, yes, because they're comparing Brazil to other countries in Latin America, which are also gifted with fine mineral reserves, but may be prone to greater volatility politically or economically, namely Chile, Argentina, Bolivia and Peru. Michael Sherb, the CEO of UK-based Appian Capital, a private equity fund, which has made several mine investments in Brazil, said in an interview with S&P Global Commodity Insights, he considers that Brazil, relative to its peers in the region, is seen to offer political and institutional stability to foreign investors and is one of the company's most important investment jurisdictions. My feeling is that, both in ferrous and non-ferrous metals, governments are bound to play a bigger part in the industry and its future direction, because the energy transition requires decarbonised steel and metals to help nations meet their net zero targets. Demand for both steel and non-ferrous critical metals is growing. Governments are building up strategic stockpiles of metals and will also need to invest more in steel technologies to aid in the costly decarbonisation processes. Governments will also need to help create the markets for green or low carbon steel. Government regulation has typically been the best catalyst for change. The energy transition is about the environment, but also essentially political. And so even though we've been through steel and metals privatizations in many countries, metals and steel do look set to be heading for a period of greater government involvement again. Collaboration and cooperation will be the new buzzwords. Not only companies and associations with governments, but companies with each other, suppliers with end users to form resilient and sustainable supply chains. Over the past 2 years, we've seen major partnerships grow between iron ore producers and steel makers to achieve steelmaking decarbonisation. Now in everybody's interest as the pressure grows to reduce not only a company's Scope 1 emissions, but also its Scope 2 and Scope 3 emissions as well. We've seen over the past 2 years decarbonisation partnerships set up between Vale and Nippon Steel, Vale and Germany's SHS, Anglo-American and Nippon Steel, Anglo-American and H2 Green Steel of Sweden, BHP and India's Tata Steel, BHP and Japan's JFE Group, BHP and India's Hebis Group, and between Rio Tinto and Germany's Salzgitter, Rio Tinto and China's Shougang Group, and Rio Tinto and South Korea's POSCO. And for sure there will be many more, as low carbon steel will eventually become the industry norm. We live in a time of rapid change and growing concerns about the planet, and I feel increasingly that we in the metals business, or even just writing about metals and steel, as I do, we have a duty to inform and help push society and industry along the sustainable materials route. That is the most valued contribution we can make as individuals with knowledge of steel and metals in a larger society. Most people don't understand much about steel, and even less about that amazing mineral called iron ore, which I'm totally hooked on, by the way, and we should be telling them about steel's sustainability and how we should be using steel. Or even potentially aluminium, dare I say, instead of plastic, polymers or wood. I was actually shocked on arriving back in Brazil this year after 10 years in the UK when I saw the proliferation of plastic bottles and cutlery here. Some of the bottles are returnable, but there is a vast array of single-use plastics still on sale here in Brazil. Plastic plates, cups and spoons used commonly in restaurants, kiosks and parties, these have been banned in the European Union since July 2021, 2 years now, and will be completely banned in the UK from October this year. For sure, Europeans will complain quite vociferously if someone even attempts to offer them a plastic spoon, and some parents don't let their children go to parties where throwaway plastic gifts are distributed. Plastic drink straws have been out of use for a long time already in the EU, and in the UK it's quite common for people to use reusable metal straws. The best contribution I can make to bringing about the changes we need in society is possibly to carry on writing about the moves towards decarbonisation and sustainability in steel, metals and mining, where I've accumulated some knowledge, and perhaps particularly in mining, which still has a very dirty, dangerous and environmentally devastating image, and where so much needs to be changed, if indeed we are to sustainably obtain all the copper, nickel, cobalt, lithium and rare earths that we will need for electric vehicles, their batteries, wind turbines and the energy transition overall. And it's so important now to talk and write about recycling. Steelmakers claim steel is 100% recyclable. I keep hearing them saying that. But what percentage of the world's steel production is actually recycled, and over what time frame? Recycling of non-ferrous metals, except for aluminium, is still in its infancy, including the recovery of metals from tailings dams. These recycling industries are going to boom, particularly with new EU legislation set to come into force, stipulating the percentage of EV batteries which will need to be recycled by such and such a date. This regulation will actually be a game changer because it's so strict. The regulation requires an overall battery recycling recovery rate of 65% by 2025 and 70% by 2030. Higher recovery rates are specified for the more valuable materials. In 2025, the recovery rate of cobalt, nickel and copper must be 90% and lithium 50%, increasing to 95% and 80% respectively in 2030. These are pretty high rates. The industry is going to change. And should we even be campaigning for electric car uptake when what the world needs is more electric buses, transport that can be shared to allow us to preserve resources and cut down on waste, and which should be free for all to use. We need to get together in this. We can't be so individualistic, I think. So, recycling, the circular economy and waste avoidance are new and extremely important themes that we need to draw the world's attention to. And we don't need to be famous or even exceptionally talented to do this. Let's look at the facts, and there's changes that are staring us in the face now. The world's population has more than tripled in my lifetime. The planet's resources are finite, and we are no longer able to hide from climate change. One constant is that we will need more steel and metals. Good for the people working in this industry, due to population growth and now also due to the energy transition. We in the steel and metals industry have a duty, I feel, to express and explain this trend. This can be our positive contribution, so let's just do it. Before I leave you, I'd just like to say a big thank you to everyone in the steel, metals and mining communities who have helped to make my stay in Brazil a success and so enjoyable and stimulating. Everyone who offered me interviews and explained the way these industries work, all the press officers who set up interviews and arranged plant visits, and everyone who chatted to me at events and held my hand when I needed that. Keep up that great work. Thank you.